Hello and welcome to BCR's new edition of Webcasting. I'm delighted to be joined today by Geoff Wynne, who's partner at law firm Sullivan and Worcester. He's also co-author of a recent white paper published by ITFA, and that paper is on the subject of making trade an investable asset class. It's also the subject of a new conference that we are doing, BCR doing in collaboration with ITFA. That's going to take place on the 9th of March at the offices of SMBC in London. And that is the topic of conversation today with Geoff. Geoff, welcome.
Thank you.
Geoff, I want to ask you, this is quite a new and exciting area, I think, and has lots of potential for perhaps opening up the whole market for uh, trade finance and for investors in this area. Um, I mean, typically and previously, this has been very much the preserve of banks and maybe sizable qualified institutional investors in terms of investing in this space. What do you think are maybe the opportunities and implications for funds and non-bank investors, which is what we're really looking at, for getting into this space? What sort of environment should we hope to get to attract them in, and what could they benefit from this? I mean, obviously, um, trade assets are considered to be low risk, but what else is there that we can say about this environment for them?
I've been doing trade finance for more years than I care to remember. Famous phrases that I have helped support and indeed use are things like trade gets paid. So the consequence of that is that trade assets must be attractive to somebody who wants to invest funds because, as you say, they would be considered low risk. But in order to explain to a non-bank investor what we are talking about, one of the keys will be to define trade assets within this context. And this, put simply, a trade asset is, if you like, something that a supplier of goods and services gets when his buyer agrees to make payment for those goods and services. Consequently, the supplier's asset, which the non-bank investor wants, is the receivable. And what is the receivable? One man's receivable is another man's payable, is actually the buyer's payable. So if we could keep that as the simplest way of explaining the trade asset, we can start then rolling out, getting involved in the trade asset to non-bank investors. Because you're right, banks classically have looked at it. We've talked over the years of things like invoice discounting, factoring, forfeiting. All of these terminologies were created, if you like, in an interbank environment. This is what I, as the bank, have, and explaining it to supplier and buyer at each end.
Yeah, so this is one of the concerns that's been mentioned about funds and non-bank investors being able to understand the terminology and the environment of receivables and payables. Um, and keeping it simple, as you say, I guess is one of the key aspects of this. Uh, is that the greatest obstacle, do you think, in getting investors on board and accepting trade finance as an investable asset class? What do you think is the greatest obstacle that needs to be overcome to get this going?
Well, the greatest obstacle, in some sense, is the documentation that supports what I have just said. Because I've kept it simple, which I say supplier sells, buyer pays, supplier sells that receivable, buyer pays it. The reality is, of course, that that is full of uncertainties because the buyer has to perform its payment obligation, but it will only perform that payment obligation when the supplier has performed his obligation. His obligation is, of course, processing goods, shipping goods, and delivering them. The non-bank investor doesn't want to know about that at all. So what he wants to know is that he is buying a payable which the buyer says, I will pay, and I will pay it on a particular date in that amount. And that means we have to deal with some of the commercial bits that lie behind it, which is the buyer, in respect of that particular payment, may not withhold payment for any reason whatsoever. So if the goods are defective, he's not giving up his rights, but he can't withhold the payment. If he's got a credit note, he gets a discount. That should be outside this particular payable. Because somebody investing in the asset who is looking at the promise to pay says, I don't want to know about documents. I just want to know that I'm taking the credit risk of the buyer. And that credit risk is that the buyer is unable to pay for financial reasons that amount on that particular day. That is different from the interbank structure, where what the seller of that receivable would say to the buyer of the receivable, i.e. the funder, look, here's the documents, you make your decision as to whether you want to buy this receivable based on these documents. In the non-bank forum, the non-bank says, no, I don't due diligence any of these documents. That's your responsibility. I just look at the credit risk. That is a mindset change for the seller of the receivable, and is equally, if you like, got to be reflected in the rest of the documentation that goes around it. And the other implication, which is interesting, is that we always say that the magic of the receivables financing is that they are short term, 30, 60, 90 days, 180 days maximum. The investor, of course, wants to be fully invested. So we have to work out what to do. The investor puts his money out at day one, buys a receivable, keep it simple, 100 payable in 90 days' time. After 90 days, he says, actually, I don't want that money back. I want to know it's paid, but I want it reinvested. So those are the, if you like, the implications of working out how you can have a fully funded program for the non-bank investor.
So again, we're going back to this aspect of trying to keep it simple. They're only really interested in the credit risk, not the documentation aspects to it. Going back to on the payable side, where does the irrevocable payable undertaking come into this in terms of the risk aspects? And also, there's been a lot in the news recently in this sector about digitalizing the IPUs. Where do you see this fitting in terms of helping the investor position?
The IPU, the irrevocable payment undertaking, exists now. What you need to get into the mindset of the buyer is that when he approves an invoice, he gives an irrevocable payment undertaking that he will pay that invoice on its due date. That is the asset that the non-bank investor wants to buy. So the quality of that payable is crucial. What does digitisation do? Well, working with the It for D&I initiative, we created an IPU that could be transferred. So we said we can create this digitally and we can transfer it. What we can't do is we cannot create it as a digital promissory note under the English Bills of Exchange Act. The Electronic Trade Documents Act, that hopefully will be passed in the early to mid part of this year, will allow for that digital promise to exist. That intangible promise, if it meets certain criteria, will exist. Consequently, it can then be issued, purchased, and traded so long as it meets the legal requirements of exclusive control of the digital record, held in a reliable system. That means it's a promissory note for the purposes of the Bills of Exchange Act. Any transferee can take a transfer by endorsement. Electronic endorsement needs to be created, not by way of transfer, and becomes the very magic holder in due course. And if you like, the education around the initiatives here is to say, if everybody agrees that this is what we want to achieve, look how much more we can have invested in trade finance.
Mm. So this potentially can open up significant opportunities in terms of investors, secondary markets, providing more liquidity into the whole area of trade and trade finance. So this is potentially very, very big for the sector, wouldn't you say?
Oh, big, exciting.
Mm.
It's, if you like, as an old school person who did not just trade but forfeiting years ago was exactly what this was. The buyer forfeits the right to withhold payment in exchange for better transaction terms. In reality, we're saying to buyers, give up that right, give a better quality promise to pay, and look what that does to the trade finance market. Look how much more trade can be financed. That's what the D&I initiatives, that's what all these initiatives are about. And quite frankly, because I know some of my co-panelists will talk about securitization devices, which of course can be used, but in reality, you could, back to my phrase, keep it simple. As long as you get the quality of the promise to pay, and the quality deals with whatever onboarding is necessary, we can expand trade and trade finance hugely and make it very attractive to non-bank investors.
Mm. And how big could this get potentially? I mean, are we going to start getting into the area of capital market rules and trade debt exchanges? I mean, is that a good thing, or is that a concern if we start getting into that level of detail and
Well,
complexity, if you like?
the answer to that is, some would say this is fantastic. We'll have trade finance, trade debt exchanges. Keep it simple. No, I don't think that's exciting, because I think that if you have to start having 200-page prospectuses in order to do trade finance, that's bad news. So my idea is that we should continue to reflect trade debt, short-term trade payables, and hope that the regulators, the investor side, says, no, that's fine. This is not an area that we want to have an overlay of capital market requirements and regulations. And that would be particularly so if the investor class at the top level is professional, so sophisticated investors, because I think we can still make it work.
And finally, Jeff, how important do you think events such as this, the Trade Investment Forum, how important do you think in getting all these people together to discuss all these areas in terms of moving this forward and trying to open up this whole sector to non-bank investors?
Michael, it's hugely important because it's only by open forum discussion that we can get the understanding across so that we're all talking the same language. And as a result of that, we can then document in a way that the investor class says, I recognize that. I know what you are offering me. The seller achieves what he wants because he says, yep, you told me that you would only buy certain receivables, eligibility criteria. All of these definitions will be expanded and explained, I hope, at the forum in March. So people will now say, now we understand. Now we're talking the same language. Now let's get on and do some business.
Geoff Wynne, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you and hearing more from you on the 9th of March at the Trade Investment Forum, as I said before, at the offices of SMBC in London. And if you want to join that event, please go to the BCR publishing website, and you can purchase tickets online at that site. And if you are a fund or a non-bank investor, then you can in fact join this event for free. Geoff, thanks again, and look forward to seeing you at TIFF next month. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. I look forward to seeing everybody there. Thanks a lot. Bye now.